Hello and welcome everyone, and thanks for joining us today. This webinar will be a live demo of some of CloverDX's features, and presenting today is Branyo Repchek, our Director of Sales Engineering. And he'll be showing us how to use CloverDX Designer to debug your transformations with a quick look at CloverDX Server 2. Just a small housekeeping note before we start. If you do have questions, please just use the Q&A box to submit them, and Branyo will answer them at the end. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Branyo.
Thank you, Tessa. So as Tessa mentioned, today I'll talk a little bit about debugging. This is going to be a live session, so I don't have any slides with diagrams or anything like that. I'll show you our product, CloverDX, and I will show you how you can debug something and how you can use the features that our tools provide to find where the problems might happen, or to just look at your data as it's being processed. So with that, let's just have a look at the first tool that we'll show. This is the Designer. And for those who are just a little bit familiar with Clover, this is the tool where you design and build all your data transformations. I have a very simple example here on which I'll show how you can use debugging functionality in Clover. This example loads a file with customer data and loads that into a Snowflake data warehouse. It's very simple. It doesn't perform any complicated business logic, just validation of the data, adding some timestamps and straight load up to the warehouse. This is something that you might build after a business comes to you with a request to load some customers, for example, from a trade conference or something similar. So they give you a list of contacts and you just have to deal with that. As everything with Clover, we can run this transformation. So let's do just that. First, I'll clear my database. I'm using a testing warehouse, so I can do that very simply. And that should finish within about a second. And let's now run the data load. The first thing that you'll notice when you run something in Clover is that you see runtime statuses on everything. So we can see the record counts coming from the input files and then every step in between. For example, in this case, we can see that we're at 30,000 records from our input file, then filter them down to just 6 rejected records over here in the validation step, and all of those went into our warehouse and have been loaded successfully. Another useful tool that we have in Clover are the status icons, the check marks that you can see when you are watching transformation happening live. All of the data that you can see here, the tracking information, is kept by CloverDX Server. So it's available also for all transformations that you do not start manually by clicking play in the Designer, but they can start, for example, by scheduler automatically, or by event listener, and so on. Another very useful thing that helps you a lot during debugging and development in CloverDX is what we call Data Inspector. This is a tool that allows you to click at any point in the graph and see the data as has been processed by Clover at that point. So for example, in here we can see the layout of the data on the edge coming from what I call a split phone into the validator. For example, in here we can see our error records, right? So in here I see that my ID field, I have some empty values, which of course is not something that I can load into a database. This is something that allows you to investigate your data in more depth, because, for example, you can use filtering to see records that have certain properties. For example, if I wanted to see what people from California are up to, I can just select here and create a filter for records from California. Okay, and for some reason it doesn't apply. So let's go from here. And I can also create different filters based on anything else. So any condition that you can write in Clover, you can create over here. So for example, this will filter based on California. And then you can see that I have the records over there. One thing you should not forget when debugging is that the filter is remembered. So you should clear it once you do not need it, because otherwise you'll just see a subset of your data, which can be quite confusing at times. You can add as many filters as you want to the data, so you can narrow down your range if you, for example, suspect that some records are not handled properly. You can very easily filter down to just those records. Let me just reset this one so that we see everything. Another thing to remember is that by default, Clover will remember only first 1,000 records from each edge. This is done in order to not store so much data and not to slow down the transformation. So if you have as many records as I have, for example, in here, 30,000, I will not have all of them in here. I will only be able to view first 1,000. If I want to see more, I can explicitly enable debugging for all records, for example, here, and then Clover will store everything. Another very useful feature, especially when you have something like this, where you don't want to damage data, for example, in the database, or you don't want to run certain lengthy feature, is something that we call disable as trash. This means that you can click at any point in a graph and disable component and all components that depend on it so that they do not run. I'll do that with my Snowflake writer so that I can now rerun this transformation as many times as I want without actually writing anything to Snowflake. The effect of everything else will be the same, except this part will not run. And I can test this. It will be a little bit faster because the write itself takes a couple seconds, but the result will be the same otherwise. Now, this is a very basic stuff. And obviously, when you have something a little bit more complicated, you can use other features. For example, the execution view allows you to see the hierarchy of your jobs as it was running. Since we were running everything on the server, we can also look at the history on the server. So I'll switch to the server now. This is a server user interface. As you can see, I'm connected through my browser, and this is the job that I have started just now. And I can see all the statistics, number of records that were transported across all edges, and so on. So this is available also for jobs that were started automatically, and it is very useful for helping you when debugging issues on production where debugging mode is not enabled, because otherwise you'd probably keep a lot of data in your debug. What is interesting is if you click on something that's a little bit more complicated, this is the previous execution of the job with Snowflake write enabled. In my case, you can see that the Snowflake writer is a subgraph, so the hierarchy is a little bit more complex and consists of two jobs. This is just the writer that physically writes data into the database. If you do not want to use this interface, but rather look at something that happened in the server before, you can always connect to a job that was running on a server and see the statistics that the server collected for that job so far. So for example, in this case, if I wanted to look back, the run ID is 7811, and I can go back and connect to a job. So I will need 7811, and it will open that job, including the logs, and I can investigate the execution. I can even look into the bulk writer component to see what it was doing, right? I can see my data coming over here, 30,000 records, and then some database operations. So this is another level of detail that you can see for anything in Clover, and it's especially useful for jobs that you were not able to watch live because someone just gave you logs or just run ID and after something has happened. Now, of course, if you do something in your jobs, if you have some business logic there, you can write it in multiple different ways in Clover. For example, a simple way is to write some basic CTL code. In this case, what we are doing is that we are adding 2 timestamps to the data. Right? These 2 fields are set to the current time so that we can track when each record was created or updated in the database. Since this is the first time insert, we set both of them to the same. If you had a bug in a business logic like this, you can very easily place breakpoint in there. You do that by switching to a tab called source that shows you the source code and just double clicking on the border of your edit window to create a breakpoint. This is actually a very interesting thing because it allows you to pause the execution of the transformation and then just step through the code and look at exactly what variables have been created, how your data changes as the data is being calculated, and so on. If you just run the graph as it is, nothing will actually happen. To enable breakpoints, you have to run your graphs in debug mode. This is done by clicking on the little bug icon over here on the toolbar. So I'll do just that and run my graph. and I'll see the breakpoints being hit after a little bit because the graph runs quite quickly. And in this view, you can see everything that's happening in your transformation. Everything else in the graph can run if there is some data to process, but the component where the breakpoint is placed is paused and it will wait for your input. If you've seen Eclipse and how debugging Eclipse works, you are probably pretty familiar with this kind of interface. You can hover over different elements, for example, over variables, records, and so on, and see their values. You can use the toolbar to advance code and move to the next step. And you can use the variables on the right side or expressions to look at anything that's currently available in the code. For example, in here, in the variables, we see our input record, right? So we see all the fields that are there and their values. If we wanted to test some computation, we can add expressions over here by adding something new. This is something that you can type anything that's a valid CTL code in Clover. So for example, you can type something like this. I think I have a field called state there. And then it will display the value. This is very useful if you have a complex calculation written all on one line, so it's very hard to go into it, and you can just pick little parts of that and write them as different expressions. Most of the time, the variables should be enough to get a good view of what's happening. To advanced code, you have two options. You can either use step into, which will go into functions, which we don't have any here, so doesn't have any effect, or you can do step over, which will just grab the current value. So I can just either click my mouse, or as developers you will probably use keyboard, so let's just use that and show a little bit more of what's happening. And you can see all the changes happening live as the code goes here, and changes in output records or in other fields are always highlighted in here. So even if you missed something and just overlooked a step, you will always be able to see what was changed, right? So for example, we see that on line 5, which copies data from input record to the output record, we changed almost every field, and timestamps are updated in the last 2 steps. If I don't want to use the breakpoint anymore, for example, after I've seen enough and the code seems to be doing what it needs, I can disable it at any point and just click run. You can of course stop the transformation if you found a bug and something happened there. Now, another thing that I had there is a different component with a little bit more code. So let's actually stop that and look at that one. And I've placed a different kind of breakpoint into that component. It's this component called split phone. So let's have a look at the code over here. And this one is a little bit more complicated, because what it does is it actually splits phone numbers that are written all as a single field on input and puts them into 2 different fields. And in some cases, you might want to look at whether this is doing what it's supposed to. So I placed the breakpoint in here, and I created as a conditional breakpoint. So this is something that you can create by going to breakpoint properties and writing any condition over here. In my case, I'm looking for phone numbers that have at least 2 phones in there, right? I only read 2, so I want to see if there are some where I have more than that, or if the input field is too long. The phone numbers that I'm processing are American phone numbers, so 28 characters is 2 phone numbers plus some extras if someone typed them there, and I want to see what happens there. All right, so this breakpoint will not activate unless these conditions are hit. So let's try and run it again. I disabled the breakpoint in the timestamp, and let's go there again. It will behave just like before, except this time the code is a little bit more complicated. So I can, for example, look at the value of my phones by hovering my mouse over that and see that it contains 3 phone numbers. You can see that they are all formatted differently. So this is why we have validator in there. And as before, I can step through the code and just let it happen. What is interesting about this is that if I hit continue, it might hit that again a couple thousand records later when the condition is hit again. And as before, I can get rid of the breakpoint if I do not want it, I can keep it or disable it. I'll just delete it in this case and just continue running and finish the transformation. When something like this is done, so when you place breakpoints, you'll see that the graph can take any time. It can run as long as you keep your code open. There's no timeouts or anything like that, unless you have specifically configured a timeout for some of the processes in your transformation. Right. One thing to remember is that when you switch to debugging, it switches to a different perspective, and obviously this is not the way that you want to develop your graph. So once you are done with breakpoints, it's good to switch back to CloverDX perspective by clicking on the little icon over here. Right. So next, let's have a look at a few other features that we have on the server. As I mentioned, during debugging, it's very important to know how many records were processed, and it's always useful to see that in the history. And you can also use filtering over here to filter down transformations based on their statuses. So for example, if you have a server that's loaded and a lot of data is being processed through many jobs, it might be very hard to find the ones that failed. So it's very easy to specify the status over here. For example, if I wanted to see errors or aborted jobs, I can filter that down over here. Right? And typically when you debug something in Clover, you almost always will use both the designer and the server because both tools are usually needed when you run more complex transformations. Let's reset the filter so that we can go back. And this is basically everything about the debugging. There are, of course, a lot more advanced topics when you want to debug something a bit more, but they are more or less just variations on the same theme, just using breakpoints a little bit more effectively by placing them in different components or configuring more complex conditions for each breakpoint. So thank you for your attention, and back to you, Tessa.
Thanks, Branyo. That's great. I hope you all found that useful. It doesn't seem like we have any questions, so I guess we will wrap up for today. So again, thanks for a great demo of debugging in CloverDX, and thanks all for attending. I shall ping the recording over by email. So yeah, thanks again, and hope to see you at our next webinar. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.